chair of Frederick County Progressives. I would like to thank you for attending this discussion on the Blueprint for Maryland's Future on behalf of our sponsors, which are Frederick County Progressives, the Asian American Center of Frederick, RISE, Resources for Immigrant Support and Empowerment, the Association of Nigerians in Frederick, and the Frederick chapter of the NAACP. We are providing Spanish translation by Cara Morales for those who need it. Hopefully by hitting the interpretation icon, it will take you, and selecting Spanish, you'll be taken into a room where you can hear Spanish interpretation of the event. Finally, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So please place your questions in the chat, and Cap, who's running the Zoom, will take your questions and ask them at the end. This evening we have.
If you have a technical question, send it to me through chat and just select me as the person receiving the message.
Okay. So yes, that's right. So if you have any specific question that you'd like to ask Cap, select his name and it'll go directly to him. This evening we have two speakers, Shamoya Gardner of Strong Schools, Maryland, and Frank Pantanella from the Maryland ACLU. Shamoya is the executive director of Strong Schools, Maryland. She's a first-generation American and the first person in her family to graduate from college, and she hails from Miami, Florida. Due in part to her experiences as a former educator, she is determined that life is best spent working at the intersection of education, advocacy, and youth development. Shamoya's professional experiences include directing the education policy portfolio at Advocates for Children and Youth in Baltimore, Cradle to Career Spectrum policy analysis at the Family League of Baltimore, project-based work with the Institute for Higher Education Policy, the DC State Board of Education, the Atlanta Public Schools, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Atlanta Civic Site. Shamoya is on the board of Building Our Nation's Daughters, the Intersection, and serves as coordinating mama with a revolutionary summer. Shamoya earned her master's degree in education policy and leadership from American University and her undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Florida. Frank is a senior education advocate with the ACLU of Maryland. Before coming to the ACLU in 2007, he worked as a community organizer in West Baltimore. There, he worked with public housing tenants on efforts to improve their living conditions and access resources, organize community residents to transform unsightly and dangerous vacant lots into gardens, and developed employment and enrichment opportunities for their youth. Currently, Frank works with statewide community groups, parents, and other advocates to keep them informed of important education policy matters and organizing efforts related to public education. Since 2009, he has played a lead role in working with city and state coalitions to stay the cutoffs to education funding at public schools. In 2011, he played a central role in developing a large campaign to begin rebuilding deteriorating school facilities in Baltimore City. The campaign led to a new state law in 2013 that established a $1 billion school construction program for Baltimore City, which is projected to rebuild or fully renovate 29 school buildings by 2024. This financing model was replicated in the Build to Learn Act, which will provide up to $2.2 billion for school construction statewide over the next 5 years. Currently, Frank is working with Black and Brown thought leaders throughout the state to promote inclusive, culturally responsive, and anti-racist educational practices in school. Frank holds a BA in biology and music from Goucher College and a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland. And so thank you very much for agreeing to participate, Shamoya and Frank. And so we're go ahead and set up their slides, and you guys can take over. Thank you.
Thanks for that great introduction, Bill.
Yeah.
I think we'll need to unmute Frank.
Oh yeah.
I'm actually a first generation American as well, like you, Shamoya, and the first to graduate college as well. So we have that in common, and this is what we aspire, right, for our children statewide.
Mm-hmm.
So good evening to everyone. It's great to have partners in Frederick because people like me and Shamoya need to hear directly from people who are doing the work on the ground and people who are directly impacted by the policies and systems that we work to shape. So thanks for the invitation. I want to start by giving a quick history of how we ended up here with the blueprint. Next slide, please. So back in the 90s, this is way before my time at the ACLU, my organization sued the state of Maryland on behalf of a class of plaintiffs from Baltimore City who claimed that their schools were grossly underfunded, and therefore the state was in violation of its constitutional responsibility to provide an adequate education to city public school students. This is Bradford versus the Board of Education, State Board of Education. Long story short, excuse me. The plaintiffs won that lawsuit, and the state responded by establishing the Thornton Commission, which developed a new funding formula and education policies that were adopted into the Bridge to Excellence Act of 2002, also known as the Thornton Law. This had a statewide impact. The Thornton Law increased funding for schools statewide by $1.3 billion, but after this phase of funding in 2000 to 2008, the state cut the formula due to the recession that started back in 2007. And the cut limited planned increases in subsequent years that the Thornton Law would have brought. But the Thornton Law also required the state to evaluate and make changes to the education funding formula to ensure it was providing constitutionally adequate funding to schools statewide. This effort became known as the Kirwan Commission, and now after a few intense years of research, public meetings, engagement and legislative action, we have a new $3.8 billion blueprint for Maryland's future plan. So I always like to thank the parents in Baltimore City for taking a big risk and bold legal action 2 decades ago to challenge the state on what the constitutional right to education should look like here in Maryland. But there's always more work to do, and we all need to hold our government officials accountable to ensure that the blueprint plan works for students, especially Black and Brown students, students who are English learners, students from low-income households, and students with disabilities. Based on the outcomes that have persisted for decades, they have the most to gain. I will now pass it to Shamoya to talk about the blueprint.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Next slide, please, Cap. All right, and everyone, as Frank mentioned, we have kind of been here before when it comes to issues of education policy and great reforms and promises to fully fund our public schools and bring about something called educational equity. We saw what happened with the most recent iteration, and we're going to refer back to that in a couple of points because, believe it or not, we are in that exact moment in time where our state legislature and all of our local governments will be faced with a similar decision yet again. And so what is the blueprint for Maryland's future? If you have not heard of it, I would be surprised, frankly. The blueprint is essentially a promise that our state's leaders made to provide for a world-class system of public schools in the state and provide a world-class education to every child who is a student in the state. And to Frank's earlier point, that includes all of our marginalized student groups, those with educational disabilities, those who are English language learners, students experiencing homelessness. You know, childhood poverty has increased. We'll talk a little bit about what the blueprint does there. And really every single student. That is a huge task. It is a major charge. And it is something that we as a state have yet to do. And so in order to really realize that goal and to keep that promise, we're going to need to do things a little differently. And so similar to the Bridge to Excellence legislation, the blueprint came from recommendations of the commission, that being the Kirwan Commission. Their charge was fairly simple: come up with an updated education funding formula and to create recommendations, policy recommendations that would yield a world-class school system. The 5 pillars that you see on the screen before you are the summation of those policy recommendations. It was a 3-year process, frankly, with lots of empirical research from all over the world and a lot of public feedback. And ultimately where we landed was that a blueprint for Maryland's future, or world-class schools, will be brought about by investments in early childhood education, which includes things like Patty and Judy centers, which are early learning centers co-located in Title I schools, as well as ensuring both the increased quality and the racial diversity of our teachers and school leaders. When it comes to questions of quality, I'm talking about how we prepare our educators to be in classrooms. Prior to the blueprint, there wasn't a particular mandate about teachers having to learn things like classroom management, which is an extremely vital skill if you hope to educate any children at all, but especially nowadays when there are so many other cultural and frankly political issues entering our school buildings. Beyond that, as it currently stands in Maryland, our student body is 70% students of color, and our teaching force, our librarians, our school principals, essentially most of the adults in professional roles facing our children in schools every day, 70% of them are white. And that mismatch does make for educational inequity in a myriad of ways, many of which couldn't even be quantified by the research in the blueprint. So that pillar 2 is extremely vital. It also recognizes the need to invest in educators, do things like afford them a work day where they're not in front of students 100% of the time, but they've got the opportunity to plan, do grading, meet with folks, and increase their salaries so that by, I believe, 2026, the statewide starting teacher salary in Maryland will be $60,000. And that is big news for a majority of the jurisdictions in the state. And those who probably had average salaries higher than those, places like Montgomery County, et cetera, are still forced to compete and increase their teacher salary scale by an average of about 10%. So there are a lot of gains for our educators in the blueprint, but it's also really vital to ensure that these gains are tied directly to student outcomes. The 3rd pillar is college and career readiness pathways, specifically creating new ones. It is no secret that the way we administer public education is very much the way it was initially administered when it was created early on. We are in an entirely different century now, and so our schools have to do a couple of things. Yes, prepare students for college and academic success, and the blueprint does things like fund dual enrollment courses so that students don't have to pay anything to earn college credits, as well as expand AP and IB program offerings. However, the 3rd pillar is also very clearly focused on the expansion of career and technical education courses, because frankly, there are some careers in which you don't need to go to college in order to earn a 6-figure salary. And all students in Maryland deserve to have access to economic opportunity, whatever way it comes. And so the expansion of career and technical education offerings, as well as career counseling for students in middle and high school, is going to be vital, not only to having great outcomes in the longer term, but to really make tangible for students what is possible when you succeed in school, so that by the end of 10th grade, students can be deemed college and career ready. And at that point, they would then have access to a myriad of course offerings that fit their interests. We're talking about students who can graduate with industry recognized credentials in their field. They won't be attending anyone's job training program after that. They'll be going straight to work and making a family sustaining wage. And so lots of opportunities there. The 4th pillar is more resources for all students to succeed. And if it sounds a little vague to you, frankly, this is intentional. We didn't get to address racial equity in a real way in the development of the blueprint. Frankly, the Attorney General at the time, Brian Frost, said it wasn't something that we could constitutionally consider. And so instead, the Kerwin Commission used poverty as a proxy for race. I think all of us here know that those are not the same thing. However, that is what we were able to move forward with. And so the blueprint makes amazing investments in a community school strategy, which is a direct influx of additional resources to schools with high populations of students living in poverty. Concentrated poverty, not just one student being eligible for free and reduced price meals, but high concentrations, rates of over 55% of students are essentially very detrimental to the outcomes that we want to see for our children. And so by investing in the expansion of community schools, investing in additional funding and the funding formula for students who are English language learners, as well as students with special educational needs, the blueprint is expanding what's possible for our students. We're also looking at schools as more than just a place where kids go to learn. It's a place where they're a part of a community, and that includes adults who are paying attention to them, aware of their needs, and responsive by making connections within their communities. The fourth pillar also includes the creation of the consortium on coordinated community supports. This is a group who is focused on bringing community partners into schools to support with the behavioral and mental health needs that students have. In this way, the blueprint is a potential tool to help us end the school to prison pipeline, and it is also a way to further embed our communities in our schools. The fifth pillar is the most vital, frankly, because if that doesn't get done, then we can't be sure of anything else. The governance and accountability pillar establishes the Accountability and Implementation Board. That is a state level body that has the utmost authority on the implementation of the blueprint. They are in charge of the State Department of Education, in charge of our local school systems, how the Department of Juvenile Services administers the blueprint, because they have an education program too. And ultimately, the governance and accountability pillar is really about ensuring that the financial investment we're making, which is for the next generation, is actually yielding the results that are promised. I know that was a very long overview. I promise you, we have not even touched 10% of what's in the blueprint at this point, but I think we can move forward from here. Frank?
Yes. Can you hear me? Mute off? Yes. Okay. We're gonna, oh, this is you.
Oh, I think this is early learning. Oh yeah,
Yes.
it is back to me. And so again, earlier I referenced some of the things that are available. I told you we didn't touch all of it. That first pillar includes pre-kindergarten expansion. I do believe that as a part of the pre-kindergarten expansion, Frederick County, like many other jurisdictions across the state, is seeing issues with school systems partnering with local providers to ensure that 3s and 4s can all be seated in the mixed delivery system. This is a part of the struggle of implementation. We're trying to create a world that does not yet exist. And so there are lots of opportunities abound right now to describe the kinds of partnerships that could result from this. For example, I believe it's Prince George's County, but don't necessarily quote me here. There's at least one jurisdiction where their county is working with Head Start providers, as well as like the school system employed teachers of pre-kindergartners, and ensuring their staffing available with private providers, and essentially braiding funds so that they can more appropriately serve all of their students. The supporting of families is really what comes with the PADI centers. They're also known as family support centers, and they work very closely with our child care resource centers. Those are places embedded in communities, not specifically in schools, where the family, be it kinship care, direct parental care, et cetera, can get resources to help them support the needs of their child. It might be signing up for WIC, or SNAP, or TANF, or it might be having access to a group of parents for socio-emotional benefit, because parenting is really, really hard and circumstances are difficult right now. The PADI centers, of course, also provide additional resources, things like availability to sign up for the State's Child Care Scholarship Program, which is also being expanded to help flesh out some of the needs in that early childhood education space. If you are looking for a point of immediate advocacy beyond making sure the blueprint is fully funded, because we haven't gotten there yet, I would encourage you to think about the kindergarten readiness assessment. The blueprint requires a racially and culturally unbiased kindergarten readiness assessment, and I guarantee you that test has not been created or administered. And so tons of opportunity here, and this is a constant theme you'll hear from me, this promise doesn't get kept, this work doesn't actually get done unless we're involved. So I think we can go back to you, Frank.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about what the blueprint has for English language learners. Outcomes for English language learners are currently unconscionable. They are scoring among the lowest in the state on math and literacy proficiency tests. And we know that they have every bit of potential as any other student, right? And that outcomes can drastically improve if our public schools make big changes that are responsive to their needs. So, during the deliberations of the Kirwan Commission, advocates reached out to the commission and legislators to develop new policies and urge them to develop new policies and practices for this population. And fortunately, we were able to work in a directive to MSDE in the blueprint law for MSDE to facilitate a work group on English language learners to do this work after the bill passed. I worked with a coalition of English language learner advocates, including parents, teachers, and students, to form what we now call the Community Work Group on English Language Learners, or Community Well, to ensure that those who are most impacted by the policies were included in the work to develop these new policies. The work started back in 2021. This was when the legislature overrode Governor Hogan's veto of the blueprint the previous year. So the law was enacted, and the directive became law for MSDE to work on or put the work group together and facilitate those meetings. So we started working in 2021, and over a couple years, we did a lot of engagement with MSDE, and just happy to say, I know there's been a lot of complaints about our superintendent, but he really treated us really well. He came to our meetings. He held a huge, we sponsored a huge listening session, and he said he wanted to co-sponsor it with us. And we were really digging into the community and talking to people who don't speak English, who don't show up at MSDE meetings, who don't show up at local board meetings. So we wanted to get to the real people who needed to voice their concerns, and that's what we did. And he showed up to that listening session. And so after 2 years of this work, MSDE released its full report on English language learners. And basically, here's a summary of the recommendation. And really, that's where they are now. They're just recommendations. We need to advocate, like Shamoya said, to ensure that these get implemented. At the core of these recommendations is overhauling the framework for our schools and centering multiculturalism. So instead of thinking of non-English speakers as having a deficit, the report lifts up diversity in culture, lived experiences of ELL students, and language, and seeks to implement an asset-based approach for English language learners and for native English speakers, because real transformation takes all of us, right? So what does all this mean? Where one very simple change is relabeling the term English learner or limited English proficiency students to emergent bilingual students, so EBs and not ELLs, right? And it's easy to see kind of the deficit versus asset labeling there, right? Where they are emergent bilingual students and not, only limited in their English proficiency. It also means, it means extensive cultural competency training for all staff in schools and at the administration level for local districts and MSDE. The goal is to erase the current deficit mindset that is pervasive among all of us. It means digging into policy and adopting new models and practices that are culturally responsive, such as boosting family engagement and communications, which includes materials produced in the native language of students and families, and done in a way that is timely and culturally informed. Equitable assessments for English learners. I've heard a lot of complaints over the years that certain students have been misplaced because the assessment tool that's being used did not capture the knowledge of students accurately. Consequently, they were placed in the wrong grade or the wrong class or subject learning environment, or not placed in an advanced course. There are also language and cultural barriers that lead to misdiagnoses among the ELL special education population, which leads to misplacements. We need more bilingual teachers, bilingual administrative staff, bilingual facilitators to be readily available during important meetings with families, such as at IEP meetings. We need to ensure that ELLs have access to the same opportunities that native English speakers have, such as advanced courses and full offerings of college and career programs, and not just the construction trades, right? establishing of two-way dual language immersion programs throughout the state. That means English learners will learn in both English and their native language, and native English speakers will also have this opportunity to learn in their language and in another language. There was actually a bill filed last session, House Bill 1098, Multilingualism is an Asset Act, that would have provided grant funding for districts to develop these programs, but it didn't pass. It had it was expensive, right? A large fiscal note attached to the bill. And right now, legislators are very much focused on funding the blueprint as written and not adding to the costs. But we hope there's an opportunity to pass that in the future, perhaps near future. Because across the board, multilingual or dual language immersion schools outperform monolinguistic schools. And there are a couple of examples of these programs in Frederick, several more in Montgomery County and Prince George's. So the recommendation is really to significantly expand these programs. And lastly, the report calls for a more equitable and nuanced way of allocating funds to schools that serve English language learners. Students that have very little to no English should get a higher per pupil allocation than a student who is approaching proficiency. And that was also part of House Bill 1098. So we'll need to advocate and keep that high on the priority list as we move forward. And I'll pass it back to you, Shimoya.
Thanks, Frank. And so we're going to dive just a little bit deeper into the fourth pillar. Again, more resources for all students to succeed. And you may have noticed that when I gave the overview of the 5 pillars, this is where I talked about English language learners. But I want you to just pay attention to the placement of these items, even in the course of this presentation, because it's outlining what's also true about the blueprint. There is work to do to support English language learners, students with educational disabilities, students who are new arrivals to the country in every single pillar of the blueprint and at every single stage of their educational experience. And so in talking about pillar 4, I'm actually going to reference the funding formula. If you'll bear with me for a moment, imagine the education funding formula for the state of Maryland as a series of circles in an equation. So the first part of the equation is the foundation. That is how much it costs to educate an average student. Can I define an average student for you? No. But we can say that that is any student where there are not additional weights that contribute to how much their school system receives in order to educate them. So we'll call that the foundation, the base amount. Maryland has an additive formula. And so in addition to the foundation, if you have a student who qualifies for compensatory education, they are eligible for free and reduced price meals. Or if you have a student who is an English language learner or has an IEP or 504 plan because they have special educational needs, there's also then an additional weight added to the foundation of the formula to further support the student. And I think on the surface, this is pretty logical. You know, the more needs, the more funding you get. It speaks to the recommendation Frank was just talking about, the weighted, more nuanced funding amount for students of different proficiencies. That's what Maryland already does. What changed about the funding formula when the blueprint was passed was not only the amount in the foundation, but our legislators took the additional step of adding an entirely new weight to the funding formula, an entirely new category. And that category is called concentrations of poverty. So concentrations of poverty are generally defined as schools where 40% or more of students are eligible for free and reduced price meals. Under the blueprint, we've set the threshold at 55% for now. And there will be opportunities when the blueprint is fully implemented in 2032 to revisit the success of this strategy and maybe move that sliding scale down a little bit more. The point there is to recognize that concentrations of poverty have additional impacts on the educational environment students experience. It's different if 99% of the students that you're attending school with are also in dire economic circumstances. It makes a difference as to the kind of resources that are available at your school, which teachers are willing to teach at your school, the conditions of the school building, the relative safety of even being in a neighborhood of a school that has that rate of poverty. And so what the blueprint does is give individual schools based on their student population. So not at the district level, with one caveat, we'll talk about that in a moment, but individual schools receive additional funding up to $3,200 per student through the Concentration of Poverty Grant Program, depending on the overall concentration of poverty in the school. In addition to that, each school also receives about $257,000 to support 2 staff positions. One is a school health services practitioner, similar to a school nurse, and the second is a community schools coordinator. So I also referenced community schools earlier. The simplest way to define them is it's a school where a student's non-academic needs are met so that they can succeed academically. There are a lot of ways that community schools can take shape depending on the specific needs of their student bodies. We have community schools in Baltimore City where rather than detention, students go to a wellness room and they actually practice meditation and deep breathing and conflict resolution and things like restorative practices. During times of economic strife, which always seem to be present for public schools, community schools, explicitly those that were pre-existing in Baltimore City, were able to leverage their partnership to the tunes of millions of dollars to make up for gaps at the state and local level. And that kind of resilience and those kind of connections are extremely vital when you consider the larger point of this pillar, ensuring that all students succeed, because when we're in community like that, it's hard to leave people behind. The consortium, I also referenced earlier, so that's a body that actually has an RFP, a request for proposals, out right now to community-based entities for a total of, I think, about $120 million so that they can begin to form those partnerships and provide services to schools and, again, throughout the community to strengthen the overall communities that our students are coming from. School health supports were already touched upon in the community schools provision, but I also wanted to highlight for you all that Maryland has had school-based health centers for a while. We do not have many. They're not all of the best quality, but that is, again, an opportunity for Maryland to grow and build on the funding and the resources that are allocated as part of the blueprint. Frank?
Yes, next slide, please. So a little bit more on the consortium. I just, Shamoy and I were talking, and both of us realized that we don't know how this really interacts with the full blueprint, because they're located, they're situated, well, they're within the Department of Health at the state level. But they do have people from MSDE and local school systems on their in their membership. And they're also private health practitioners or mental health practitioners making up this 25-member entity. And just so you know, and this is something that you can share with providers that you know in the community, is that this consortium provides grants to community-based providers to meet students' behavioral health needs and other related challenges in a holistic and non-stigmatized manner. Shamoy is right. There's 120 million available now. The deadline for submitting an application is coming up soon. I think it's like next week. And that's one thing I meant to check up on. And we know that awards are going to be announced in December 2023. For a provider to get funding, they have to approach the school system. They may already have a partnership with the school system or a particular school, but the provider needs a letter of support for their proposal, right? And that's just, to align with, what the district believes is needed in those schools. And then the provider can apply directly to the consortium. That should say directly and not directly to the consortium. And when I was speaking to one of the staff at the health department, they said that there are a lot of applications coming in, and they don't know right now how far or how much money they will dole out in this first round. And there could be a possible second round in January or February of next year. And one thing to look at here is that there is no formula really for distributing this money. They're looking at geographical representation. So in other words, spreading the money around the state. But a lot of us who who work in this field are thinking, no, there needs to be a more equitable way of thinking about how you spend $120 million, especially directing it to the students and to neighborhoods that have been traditionally discriminated against, have been redlined, things like that. We know those neighborhoods and those children have much bigger challenges than a lot of other kids living in different environments. So that's something to watch. I encourage everyone to spread the information about that. And one other thing to share, when I talked to the staffer at the health department about this, she said she would be willing to round up people who are working on this at the health department and speak to providers and come out to community meetings. So that's something we can work with Frederick County Progressives about on in the future. Okay, next slide.
Thanks, Frank.
Yep.
And so the final pillar that we're going to dive into today is Pillar 5, Governance and Accountability. I talked a little bit about the AIB, but let's back it up. There are measures of accountability for the implementation and success of the blueprint at the state and local levels. So first, we have our expert review teams. These are actually put together by the Maryland State Department of Education, but the plan for deployment is approved by the Accountability and Implementation Board. These are education professionals, some who are former educators, current educators themselves, literacy specialists, experts in the field, who come together and they conduct non-punitive evaluations of how our schools are functioning under the blueprint. And I stress that they're non-punitive because in education reform, there's usually a threat of, if you don't do this, or if you don't see the successes we want, we'll take your money away. That's not what the blueprint does. It literally was created to address underfunding of schools. And so the reviews of our expert review teams are very much focused on continuous improvement, addressing the needs of students and school communities as they are encountered. We recognize that the blueprint, though it is very long and complex and quite an investment, it is still just a blueprint. And there are many things that we're going to learn along the way about how our schools function and why it is that we're seeing the specific results we do. The expert review teams are a very localized, intentional, personable way to ensure that we understand what's happening in our schools and that we're actually supporting folks, not just, as our critics like to say, throwing money after a bad problem. And so the expert review teams will have relationships with the folks in the school. They'll come back, they'll work with them as they develop solutions and evaluate what it is that they observed. And so long as our schools and our school districts are implementing the feedback they receive, they're not going to be held in any punitive way away from receiving their funds. However, I do want to be very clear that if any of our school system leaders or any of our county government leaders think that they're going to implement some parts of the blueprint and not implement others, there will be fiscal implications for not following the law. The state is not going to continue to give money away to folks who are misallocating that revenue. And so it's very important for us to keep watch and also to know that the state is keeping an eye on how those dollars are spent. Also at the local level, there are these folks called blueprint implementation coordinators. Theoretically, their job is to be the point person jointly appointed by our school systems and our county governments to oversee blueprint implementation. And you'll notice that it is not just folks in school systems, it's also people who have connections throughout the county more broadly, because as you can see, there are a great many entities involved in this work. For example, Frank was just talking about the health department. The partnerships to expand the availability of school-based health services actually do have to happen with local health departments and others. So the blueprint implementation coordinator is the centralized local person who is in charge for implementation. When you really stop and think about that, it's a whole heck of a lot of work. What we've seen over the last couple of years is that people who had pre-existing roles in the school system then had blueprint implementation coordinator added to their workload. It's not sufficient. I believe in Frederick County, we had, what's his name, Pierre, who did press relations for the school system and also did like racial equity things, who was the blueprint implementation coordinator and worked quite a bit. We're continuing to advocate to ensure there's funding to support them in building out teams, but also to stay in touch and address the various needs that they have had throughout implementation. It is complex, but these are very hardworking people who have been responsive to some valid critiques about engagement from our communities. However, that does not mean we let them off the hook. That is our go-to person when we have questions about the blueprint. Finally, there is the Accountability and Implementation Board. And if we could go to the next slide, please. The AIB is made up of 7 folks. Thank you very much. And so actually, if we look to the person who is not aligned on the far right, that is the AIB chair, but Isaiah Leggett. Oh, my brain. If we then go back to the left side of the screen at the bottom, we've got Dr. William Britt Kerwin. He is the vice chair. And yes, I said Kerwin. That is the very same Kerwin that chaired the commissions that brought us the recommendations that became the blueprint. The other folks pictured in a logical, predictable order are Justin Robinson of Prince George's County. He's an educator. Mara Doss, who is a doctor and works for the community college in Prince George's County, preparing teachers. Thank you for following there. Below her is Dr. Jennifer Lynch. Over there at the top is Joe Minko, and below him is Dr. Laura Stapleton. Dr. Stapleton and Dr. Lynch have been in education for a while in Montgomery County and Baltimore City, respectively. Joe Minko has been a school principal at a community school, in fact, and now works for the Able Foundation. These 7 folks are where the buck stops with blueprint implementation. There is a person who's very important here who's not pictured, and that is the executive director of the Accountability and Implementation Board. Her name is Rachel Heiss, and she knows more about the blueprint than anybody. And if there is any question or any addition that needs to be made to the law, that is the go-to person to really get some movement and get those changes implemented so that the blueprint can be a success. Next slide, please. Go back.
One up. I was going to talk about the education funding formula, but no one wants to do math at 8 at night, and we need to save time for questions and answers. So if we want to come back to this at another time, maybe, or if you want me to do it, whatever, it's up to you. But let's skip it for now and go to the next slide. And I'll put you to sleep, believe me, when I start talking about that formula. Impact of the blueprint funding formula on Frederick County schools. So I just pulled some numbers just to show what the difference is between last fiscal year and this fiscal year. This fiscal year is school year 23-24. And if you just go right to the bottom, the total amount is $910 million. And you can see the breakout where there have been increases. So there was a 13.2% increase in unrestricted funds, and that's both from the state and county. You can see increases to the right of those figures, increase of 37.5 million from the state that's going to the schools, and an increase of 50.7 million at the county level from local funds. And then there are some other sources like grants and some federal funds. And then there's restricted funds. And that's for teacher pensions, crossing guards, school police, other special grant programs, and other special federal programs. And that's a smaller amount, but altogether it's $910 million. So you see, you'll see step increases, at least for the next couple years. And we've had a couple step increases since the plan was implemented. And like Shamoya said, we need to lock in more money to see those step increases all the way through the 10-year phase-in period. Excuse me. Back to you, Shamoya.
All right. And so on that point, it really wouldn't be a presentation from me, from Frank, from any of us if we weren't asking you to take some sort of action as well. And so this is the year. We know that the Maryland General Assembly meets for 90 days in the winter from the second Wednesday in January to the second Monday in April. This year, they must pass legislation that fully and sustainably funds the blueprint for Maryland's future. Why do they have to do it this year? Well, I'll tell you why. Economic downturns are ahead. We know that inflation has been growing. We know that due to the actions of the folks in Congress, child poverty has doubled when it didn't have to, and that these circumstances are getting more and more difficult for folks. We are looking in the face of a government shutdown. We can't necessarily rely on our federal government to provide for us in times of economic crisis in the way that we're used to. Frankly, we can't even trust them to operate correctly all the time. 2, elections are ongoing things. You may think that elections come once every 2 to 4 years. That is not the case. Folks in the Maryland General Assembly in 2025 will be thinking about their reelection chances, and they won't be willing to do brave, bold things when it comes to our budget. And they will be faced with a myriad of other priorities from their constituents, as well as really great priorities from the governor that need to be funded and should not compete with public education. This is the year that change has to be made. So if you will please follow me to the link I've just put in the chat. You can also access this link if you go to strongschoolsmaryland.org and check out our policy and advocacy page. Take action. Fill out that form. There's a little bit of information about what's at stake with fully funding the blueprint. If you type in your information, your name, zip code, etc., it will automatically send this form with your comments to your state elected officials and let them know that you are paying attention at the very least, and you want them to keep the promise that they made with the blueprint. You're going to hear us say keep the promise a whole heck of a lot this year. You're going to see us in Annapolis in February, and hopefully you and your friends are there with us. We're going to be evaluating the success of the blueprint on February 12th, and we're going to be calling on the legislature to make good on the promise and actually fully fund our schools for the first time in our recent history. That's all from me.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really great. Hold on a second, please. Yeah, that was very informative. That was very, I'm sure that a lot of people got a lot out of that. So, Cap, what kind of questions did we get? Did we get any? And please,
I don't have any questions from the audience. If anyone would like to pose a question, if they put it in the chat, I'll make sure that it gets. Otherwise, we have some things that we might discuss, and I can put those up on the screen.
Okay, let me see. Yeah, so go ahead and read some of the questions that were submitted by the speakers, Cap.
I think we covered the advocates getting involved in the blueprint effort, and I will collect from the chat all of the links that were put into the chat during the presentation so that we can put them into a separate document to send them out to everyone. But we have a couple of questions, and I'll put the first one up here. English language learners are the fastest growing population in Frederick schools, now at 20% of the enrollment, and in schools throughout Maryland as a whole. Their outcomes are the lowest in the state. How can we make sure that the blueprint will serve them adequately would be the first question we are asking.
So I spent some time talking about the actual recommendations. I think Shamoya put a link to the recommendations from the MSDE work group on English language learners. If anyone is bored and would like something long to read and very detailed, it's actually quite good. I'm really, for all the bad things that have been said about our superintendent, he goes real deep on equity, deeper than I've ever seen coming from a superintendent, the state level or local level. I really liked him. But anyway, he's going to be leaving, but the recommendations are there. It's official. This was directed by the law. So that needs to get implemented. And I'm going to share a link in the chat. On October 11th, at 5:30, we're doing a virtual statewide town hall with the superintendent. And really the goal is to inform the public about what these recommendations are and what his sense of the timeline for implementing these recommendations looks like. So I mentioned House Bill 1098, that's Multilingualism as an Asset Act, and it would have done two things if it had passed. One was establishing dual language immersion schools, and one was tweaking the education funding formula to bring more nuance to how funding is allocated, directing more to students that need more support because they are maybe new in the country or from war-torn countries, or countries where there's a lot of unrest and they have little to no educational background. They should get a lot more funding than students who are nearing proficiency. So that's that bill, and that covers 2 of the 9 recommendations in the report. And it actually seems like there's 50 recommendations in the report if you read it, but it fits under, 9 primary categories. So we're going to be talking about this on October 11th directly with the superintendent. We're also going to invite an MSDE board member and an AIB school board member, and probably a legislator or two, because Mr. Choudhury will be leaving. There's going to be a new superintendent. We want to make sure that they hear it loudly and clearly that this work doesn't stop, right? This work has to go forward, and it has to be very much in the forefront, as well as the resources and systems that are being put in place that will help other students of color, Black children, and students with disabilities, right? So yeah, please attend the town hall and spread that around widely if you can, because this is when we're going to make an ask, and it's when we're going to kick back, or start up our advocacy again around this issue.
I do have one question. This Saturday in Annapolis, Strong Schools is going to be holding I guess you call it a rally.
A little less than that. We're not quite there yet, but it's
Okay.
the final stop on the tour for Maryland's future. Thanks,
Okay,
Phil.
so please talk about that a little bit, please.
Yes, and I'm dropping a link to register in the chat. So all summer, Strong Schools Maryland traveled across the state. We visited the various regions. We actually started right out in Frederick County, and we wanted to elevate educational issues that were not being heard. We understand that the blueprint is the law. Obviously, we're around to make sure that it's implemented with fidelity, but as I've said before, it is a blueprint. And so we wanted to give some air to those education issues that are being overshadowed either by a hyper focus on the blueprint or a hyper focus on culture wars that actually have not much to do with our students. And so this Saturday, we are getting together in Annapolis at the Wiley H. Bates Legacy Center to determine what our policy solutions will be as we narrow down those issues and develop what will be Strong Schools Maryland's 2024 legislative agenda.
Thank you.
Hope to see you there.
Yep. Well, I think that's about it. It's right at 8 o'clock, and if people have other questions, are there any other questions, Cap, that might have come in that we can ask?
No, there are not. But the next question that we were looking at was that similarly, Black students make up 14% of the school population and are not being served well by the school system. How can we ensure that the blueprint will deliver on its promise?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer without, kind of repeating what we've been saying, which is that we have to be there. We have to let folks know that we're watching. Frankly, I was in a hearing with the Legislative Black Caucus and a certain someone from the Blueprint Accountability and Implementation Board, and that person could not tell us exactly how Black students were being impacted by the blueprint. And of course, we know there are myriad of benefits, but that particular need to focus and that explicit desire to see success for Black children has to come from us, because they are our schools, they are our tax dollars going to fund this. And so our advocacy is very vital. Frank?
Yeah. I'm about to open up a can of worms, and Shamoya knows what I'm going to say.
Oh, no.
So, Mr. Reed talked about, and when he was reading my bio, stated that I was working on anti-racism practices in schools. We're at the very beginning of trying to break this conversation in the mainstream. You know, the blueprint was created with a framework that wasn't developed by Black thought leaders, right, or brown thought leaders. The framework of education is very much the same in terms of the metrics that we're going to be measuring in the blueprint, whether that be test scores, graduation rates, suspensions, attendance, things like that. But one thing that I'm trying to get traction on, and a number of people are, we're working in coalition together, is the requirement to ensure that schools and school staff and teachers are culturally competent. Um, we spoke at one of the AIB hearings last year, and a couple of us said that needs to go into the comprehensive implementation plan that was developed last year. And fortunately, they put it in there, and we asked for cultural competency to be defined comprehensively, and that is rooted in race equity principles. And we asked for a model to be developed to develop a training protocol and framework for what cultural competency means in schools. And that if we do not work on this, it can become a half-day PD or a full-day PD, a checkbox, right? And all of a sudden all the teachers are culturally competent. But in the deep kind of like just conversations that I've had with Black thought leaders and experts, they're looking at models that experts in their community have developed that just have not getting any traction, that have not been given time. And it's because when these large education reform initiatives are discussed and planned, they reach out to education experts in mainstream spaces. We're drawing from Harvard and institutions like that. Not that they don't produce great work, but they're not tapping into the expertise in the Black community that has been there for decades. And I would put my life down on it that they know a lot more about educating their own than the folks at these other institutions. So my goal is to work with the Black and brown led groups to ensure that when MSDE is doing this work on developing protocols around cultural competency, that they include that research, that body of research, and the experts that we have in our state. So in a nutshell, that's that. I think we can go a lot deeper on that, because the metrics that they're interested in terms of what are they measuring. It's not just cultural competency of teachers so they don't offend someone inadvertently, or they're saying microaggressions or whatever. It's about actually doing something to ensure Black and brown children are developing in a way that affirms their lives, that helps them build strong self-esteem, self-identity, self-determination, and efficacy, critical consciousness, understanding themselves within the context of our world, which we know is sending messages to them that perhaps they're internalizing about themselves. So
I agree. That's very important.
We have a
Captain,
question coming from a participant for you. Yolanda, you should be unmuted now. See if you
Yeah,
can.
yeah, I'm unmuted. So thank you so much. Is your name Steve Patinella?
yes, Patinella.
Okay.
Frank.
Frank
Frank.
Pentinelli.
Frank
I
is
just gave you a
fine.
new name.
Frank is fine.
Okay. So I just wanted to say I'm so glad about what you said, because my name is Yewande, and I'm the president of the Association of Nigerians in Frederick, and I'm working with some community partners right now. And we're working to put together something for the grant that you talked about. And one of the things that we're really addressing is on training, but not just training, but also being able to, training is a part of it. and we're tapping into some of the resources that have been developed already. But, you know, the partners we're working with, they're like, oh, we can do this, we can do this. We've developed this curriculum that we're working with. And we're like, yes, that's great that you've developed the curriculum. But also, the community has expertise, cultural expertise, the experience, and also the know-how. So you can bring your training, your curriculum to Frederick, but the thing is that it still has to be tailored for the different groups you're going to be working with in Frederick. So when you talk just right now, I'm like, yes, because many times all the Harvards, nothing against Harvard, they have all this curriculum that they've developed, and they're like, okay, yes, it should work. Also, one size should fit all, but it just may not work the same way in Frederick if you don't tailor it or learn from the different groups that are on ground. They have been on ground and have been doing this work for quite some time. So they know their diverse communities very well that they've been working with. So I just wanted to say thank you for saying that, because you hit the nail right on the head. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And we have worked together. We have put together that testimony support testimony for a bill that Delegate Aceveros filed for that would have established a commission to develop multicultural content for curriculum in social studies, history, and civics education. I'm not sure if you remember that, but I have your logo.
Right. We tried to, I was really behind that bill, but it did not, civic, cultural, was it civics and education or something like that? And
Something like that,
and
yeah.
it didn't pass. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the delegate's going to file the bill again. He just reached out
Good.
to me, and I'm happy to work with your group, the Nigerians in Frederick, all the groups that we worked with last year. I think we had like a dozen, but we need to like triple that amount,
Yeah,
and show
that'd
up
be
in
great.
bigger numbers. We can move the needle there. The legislature is very reluctant to do anything around curriculum because that's under MSDE's purview, and they don't want to step on their toes. But it's also a political thing too, where I think
Yeah.
they just kind of pass the buck because they've passed things that relate to the curriculum before. So,
I,
you
yeah,
know,
and I will say that like that's a really great point, Frank, to highlight the fact that we have new State Board of Education members who are a little bit more willing to actually do their jobs than the State Board of Education we've had in the past. So we have a new vice president. And I think that one of the things that happened this past session with the multilingual learner bill is that, frankly, in addition to having good ideas to get laws passed, you have to play politics. And the superintendent did not engage with legislative leadership to the extent necessary to see the success of the bill. And so the appropriate support behind the legislation, because all of those recommendations are not only required by the blueprint, they're just straight up good ideas. That presence wasn't there. And so it's really also about like making sure that the sponsoring delegate has a strategic relationship and that the conversations have already been had with members of the legislative leadership. So we're not running into little things in committee. Because frankly, and I know I'm saying this in a recorded place, but there are a lot of folks in the legislature who have something to say on education who frankly are just not qualified to do that. And so buying in the supportive leadership in addition to organizing our communities is really vital to get that good piece of legislation passed.
Frank, once the bill is reintroduced, if you will immediately give us the HB number so that we can monitor it, so that we can get the word out to people on the bill. I conduct, in conjunction with my work with Jews United for Justice, we actually have a testimony 101. We actually do classes on submitting written and submitting in-person testimony. And as soon as you can get me a bill number on that, I will make sure that the word gets out to the mailing list as the secretary of Frederick Progressive so that people will know, okay, this is a bill. We're going to let you know the dates that are important. We'll let you know when you have to submit testimony. If you need help, we'll help you write it. If you want to go to Annapolis, we'll help you figure out how to do testimony in Annapolis. So we can coordinate that through Frederick Progressives if you and Shamoya will make sure that we have the HP number the minute it comes out.
Yeah, this has been very, very helpful, very informative. The people that sponsored this talk are very appreciative. Also, too, we're going to try to, so we're going to put the recording I would like to be able to put the recording of this meeting on our sponsors so it'll definitely be on Frederick County Progressive's website. And I'd like to see it placed on the Nigerians in Frederick website and the Frederick chapter of the NAACP's website as well. So that, because there was a lot of information that was presented. And I think that if you're able to listen to the recording, you might get, you will get a lot out of it. And I know was a lot, but I do believe that it's necessary for us to be educated about this, about the blueprint and its implementation and its full funding. So I really appreciate you, Samoya and Frank, for attending this community town hall. And that's it. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.
Great.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
All right, Billy, I will convert this recording. And Sue, if you will send me the link to upload it to our Google Docs area, I can upload it into the Google Docs because it's probably going to be a large file. And then you can always get with your Wanda, you can get with Monica, of course, the NAACP, and they can pull it off of our Google Docs area and put it on theirs.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, Billy, we all set then?
Yeah, I think so. I think Frank wanted to talk a little bit after this meeting, but do you still want to talk, Frank? You're muted. Frank, you're muted.
Hold on.
You gotta unmute him.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's up to you. We had that little text exchange, and if you want to tell me anything about the dynamics here, I saw that Mr. Mahone, is it?
Yes, he was here. He was here.
Yeah.
His first question. Also, yeah. Again, I'm like you, Frank. I need to learn how to be more, not to be so abrupt. But I'm not abrupt. Not to say that you're abrupt, but I am. And so, and so it may. And so, what I say to you, what I want to say is, now you're not recording.
Wait. It's recording.
Yeah, let's take off the recording. Yes.